December 25, 1944, Christmas night, in the frozen Ardennes forest. Near the small town of Echternach in Luxembourg, a German infantry battalion was attempting to cross the Sauer River under cover of darkness. The soldiers had every reason to feel confident. A brutal winter storm had grounded Allied aircraft and made artillery observation nearly impossible. Snow fell thick and heavy through the trees. The temperature had plunged well below freezing. Thick fog blanketed the river valley. The men moved in disciplined silence, weapons ready, believing they were invisible in the darkness. Then the American guns opened fire. What happened next was unlike anything these veteran soldiers had ever experienced. The shells did not impact the ground and explode outward, as artillery had done throughout the history of warfare. Instead, they detonated in the air, 30 to 50 feet above the German positions. Hot metal fragments rained down from the sky, finding men in their foxholes, men in their trenches, men who believed themselves protected by the earth itself. There was no cover from shells that exploded overhead. There was nowhere to hide from death that fell like winter rain. When American forces counted the German dead the following morning, they recorded 702 bodies from that single battalion. General George S. Patton, commanding the Third Army, would later write to the Chief of Army Ordnance about the weapon responsible. He called it the funny fuse. He described its effects as devastating, and he declared flatly that the funny fuse won the Battle of the Bulge for us. The weapon Patton praised was one of the most closely guarded secrets of the entire Second World War. It was officially designated the VT fuse, with the letters supposedly standing for variable time. But this was a deliberate deception designed to mislead enemy intelligence. The true name was the proximity fuse, and it represented nothing less than a complete revolution in the science of killing. This was a miniature radar system crammed into the nose of an artillery shell, a device containing approximately 130 electronic components that could detect when it was close to a target and detonate itself automatically. It did not need a direct hit. A near miss was just as deadly. Over 22 million proximity fuses were manufactured during the war at a cost exceeding $1 billion, equivalent to approximately $15 billion in modern currency. The production effort employed 87 companies, 110 factories, and over 2,000 suppliers. An estimated 3% of all physicists in the United States worked on some aspect of the program. The United States War Department would later describe the proximity fuse as one of the outstanding scientific developments of World War II, second only to the atomic bomb in military importance. Admiral Lewis Strauss placed it among the very small group of developments upon which victory very largely depended. Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal declared that without the protection this ingenious device gave the surface ships of the fleet, the westward push could not have been so swift, and the cost in men and ships would have been immeasurably greater. This is the story of how a small team of American scientists solved what most experts considered an impossible engineering problem. How they built a complete radar set small enough to fit inside a shell and rugged enough to survive forces that should have destroyed any electronic device. How they kept their creation secret from the enemy for years while it killed thousands. And how this weapon, which most people today have never heard of, fundamentally changed the nature of modern warfare. Before the proximity fuse existed, shooting down an aircraft with anti-aircraft fire was an exercise in mathematical futility. The challenge was almost impossibly difficult. A gunner had to either score a direct hit on a small target moving at 300 miles per hour through three-dimensional space, or use mechanical time fuses preset to detonate at a calculated altitude. The time fuse approach required perfect range estimation, perfect calculation of the aircraft's speed and direction, and perfect timing that battlefield conditions almost never permitted. During the London Blitz in 1940, British anti-aircraft batteries expended an estimated 20,000 rounds for every German aircraft they managed to destroy. Some estimates placed the figure even higher. The mathematics of conventional anti-aircraft defense was simply brutal. Against naval vessels, the calculus was equally grim. Japanese kamikaze pilots discovered they could dive through curtains of anti-aircraft fire with a reasonable expectation of reaching their targets. The odds favored the attacker. Shells, set with mechanical time fuses, had to detonate at precisely the right moment in precisely the right location. If the fuse was set for a slightly wrong altitude, the shell would explode harmlessly above or below the target aircraft. If the range estimate was off by even a small margin, the shell would burst too early or too late. The attacking pilot merely had to survive long enough to complete his dive. Against a determined enemy willing to die, conventional anti-aircraft defense was failing. The idea of a proximity fuse, a device that could sense when it was near a target and detonate itself without human intervention, had occurred to weapons designers in multiple countries by the late 1930s. In Britain, physicist William Butemont at the Air Defence Experimental Establishment formally proposed two types of radio-based proximity fuse on October 30, 1939, just weeks after the war in Europe had begun. By May 1940, Butemont, along with Edward Shire and Amherst Thompson, had developed the concept further and submitted a joint proposal to the British Air Defence Establishment. Their concept exploited the Doppler effect, the same phenomenon that causes the pitch of an ambulance siren to change as it passes. The fuse would emit high-frequency radio waves continuously. As the projectile approached a target, the reflected waves would create a detectable beat frequency signal. When that signal reached a certain strength, indicating sufficient proximity to the target, the fuse would trigger detonation. By June 1940, British researchers had built working prototype fuses and successfully tested them in rockets fired at balloon-supported targets over the coastal waters off Wales. But the British faced a fundamental limitation that seemed impossible to overcome. Their prototypes worked in rockets, which experienced relatively gentle acceleration forces of approximately 100 times the force of gravity during launch. A standard 5-inch anti-aircraft shell fired from a naval gun was an entirely different matter. Such a shell would experience acceleration forces of 20,000 times the force of gravity the instant it left the barrel. It would spin at approximately 30,000 revolutions per minute. Every vacuum tube inside the fuse, every wire, every solder joint, every delicate electronic component would need to survive forces equivalent to multiplying their weight by 20,000. A vacuum tube weighing 3 grams would momentarily experience forces as if it weighed 140 pounds. The glass envelopes would want to shatter. The hair-thin tungsten filaments would want to snap. The delicate electrodes would want to collapse. No one had ever built electronics that could survive such violence. Most engineers believed it was physically impossible. The British could not solve this problem with their available resources. They were fighting for national survival with German bombers overhead and an invasion threat across the Channel. They needed American industrial capacity, they needed American scientific talent, and they needed both immediately. In September 1940, one of the most significant technology transfers in the history of warfare took place. A British technical mission led by Sir Henry Tizard arrived in the United States, carrying a small black metal deed box. Inside that unassuming container were Britain's most closely guarded military secrets. The box contained the cavity magnetron that would revolutionize radar technology. It contained detailed plans for jet engine development, and it contained comprehensive documentation on the proximity fuse concept. The mission included Professor John Cockcroft, who would later win the Nobel Prize in Physics for splitting the atomic nucleus. On September 19, 1940, Cockcroft sat down with Dr. Merle Anthony Tuve at the Carnegie Institution of Washington and explained the British proximity fuse work in complete detail. Tuve was perhaps the perfect man for the task that would follow. Born in Canton, South Dakota on June 27, 1901, he came from Norwegian immigrant stock. His childhood friend was Ernest Lawrence, who would win the Nobel Prize for inventing the cyclotron. Tuve himself had already made foundational contributions to physics. Working with Gregory Bright in 1925, he conducted the first measurements of the ionosphere using pulsed radio waves, research that provided key theoretical underpinnings for radar itself. He had confirmed the existence of the neutron in 1933. He had measured binding forces in atomic nuclei. Tuve combined first-rate physics knowledge with a relentless, profanity-laden, deadline-driven management style that would push his team to accomplish what experts deemed impossible. Less than a month before Cockcroft's visit, Section T of the newly formed National Defense Research Committee had been created on August 17, 1940. 1 week later, on August 24, Tuve was appointed its chairman. The letter T stood for Tuve. The committee had been created on June 27 of that year, under the chairmanship of Vannevar Bush, president of the Carnegie Institution and one of the most influential scientific administrators in American history. Bush had proposed the committee directly to President Franklin Roosevelt, who reportedly approved the concept within minutes of hearing it explained. Section T's assigned mission was to develop a proximity fuse for anti-aircraft shells that would actually work in combat. Tuve later said of the British design that Cockcroft delivered, "Not the one we made to work." The critical engineering that would transform the concept into a functional weapon would be done almost entirely in America, under Tuve's driving leadership. The VT fuse that emerged from Section T's work was a marvel of miniaturized engineering, unprecedented in the history of electronics. In essence, it was a complete radar system crammed into the nose of an artillery shell, occupying a space roughly the size of a pint milk bottle. The entire assembly measured approximately 2 1/4 inches in diameter and 8 inches in length. Each fuse contained approximately 130 separate electronic components, including 4 to 5 miniature vacuum tubes, all of which had to function perfectly after experiencing forces that would crush ordinary electronics into useless debris. The operating principle relied on the Doppler effect, a small oscillator circuit operating at frequencies between 180 and 220 MHz, used the metal body of the shell itself as an antenna. This circuit continuously radiated radio waves outward in all directions as the shell flew through the air. When those radio waves struck a target and bounced back, the returning signals interfered with the outgoing transmission, creating a characteristic beat frequency pattern. As the shell drew closer to its target, the strength of this beat frequency signal increased. When the projectile came within approximately 70 feet of a target, a 2-stage audio frequency amplifier boosted the signal enough to trigger a thyrotron tube. The thyrotron acted as an electronic switch, releasing stored electrical energy from a capacitor into an electrical detonator. The detonator fired the main explosive charge. The entire sequence from detection to detonation happened in microseconds. The power supply presented one of the earliest and most vexing engineering challenges. Conventional dry cell batteries deteriorated rapidly under tropical heat and humidity. Shells that should have functioned perfectly were arriving in the Pacific, with batteries that had deteriorated during storage in tropical conditions. James Van Allen, a young physicist who would later discover the radiation belts encircling Earth that bear his name, was commissioned as a Navy lieutenant in November 1942. In November 1943, he was sent to the Pacific Fleet to train gunnery officers on the new weapon and to identify shells with dead batteries. Van Allen established inspection stations across the Pacific theater, dramatically reducing dud rates caused by battery failure. The solution to the battery problem came from engineers at the National Carbon Company. They developed a reserve battery containing liquid electrolyte sealed inside a glass ampule. The battery could sit dormant and stable for months or even years, regardless of storage conditions. But when the shell was fired, the massive acceleration force of 20,000 gravities would shatter the glass ampule instantly. The centrifugal force of the spinning shell would then drive the electrolyte outward over stacked plates of carbon and zinc, activating the battery in a fraction of a second. This elegant design, roughly the size of a fountain pen, gave the fuse virtually unlimited shelf life while providing an inherent safety mechanism. The battery literally could not arm until the shell was fired from a gun. Lloyd Berkner, another key contributor, helped develop the theoretical framework for the fuse's radio frequency operation. His expertise in ionospheric physics proved essential for understanding how the fuse would perform at different altitudes and under varying atmospheric conditions. Multiple additional safety features prevented catastrophic accidents aboard ships and in ammunition storage facilities. A mercury switch maintained a continuous electrical short across the firing circuit while the shell sat in storage or was being handled. Only the centrifugal force produced by the shell's rapid spin after leaving the gun barrel could move the mercury through a tiny porous diaphragm and break the short circuit. This meant the fuse could not arm for approximately 0.3 to 0.5 of a second after firing, ensuring the shell was safely distant from the gun crew before becoming active. A self-destruct mechanism would detonate any shell that failed to find a target after a predetermined time, preventing unexploded rounds from falling intact into enemy hands where they might be recovered and analyzed. The rigorous safety standard demanded no more than one accidental muzzle burst per million rounds fired. The engineering challenge at the heart of the entire program was almost absurdly difficult. The team needed to make glass vacuum tubes, among the most fragile devices in electronics, survive being fired from a gun. The starting point was miniature tubes manufactured by Raytheon and Sylvania for use in hearing aid amplifiers. These were tiny glass envelopes, approximately 1¼ inches long and 3/8 of an inch in diameter. But even these small tubes would be destroyed by gun launch forces unless they were fundamentally redesigned from first principles. The critical breakthrough came from James Van Allen himself. He developed what the engineering team called the mousetrap spring, a simple, coiled spring element with a protruding V-shaped section that maintained constant tension and position on the extremely fine tungsten wire filament inside each tube. This seemingly very minor innovation prevented the filaments from snapping or deforming under the massive acceleration forces. Applied physics laboratory engineers later called the mousetrap spring the solution to the last major hurdle in vacuum tube development for the proximity fuse. Van Allen spent months shuttling between the Applied Physics Laboratory and the Raytheon manufacturing plant in Newton, Massachusetts. He would fire test rounds at the Dahlgren Naval Proving Ground in Virginia, then personally dig the spent shells out of the ground with a posthole digger and shovel. He would crack each recovered shell open to examine exactly what had happened to the tubes inside during firing. Components were packed in wax and oil to equalize stress during acceleration. Planar electrode geometries replaced the fragile cylindrical electrodes used in standard tubes. Each failure was meticulously analyzed and the design modified. The iterative process of fire, recover, examine, and redesign consumed months of intensive effort. By the end of the war, Sylvania Electric Products had manufactured tens of millions of miniature vacuum tubes, specifically for proximity fuses, representing a substantial portion of the entire pre-war American radio tube industry output. Sylvania employed approximately 10,000 workers, predominantly women, who turned out roughly 1 million tubes every 2.5 days around the clock. Most of these workers were searched when entering and leaving the plants. They were forbidden from discussing their work with anyone outside the facility. They were never told what they were actually building. One worker's daughter recalled decades later that her mother always believed she had spent the war soldering the tips of light bulbs. The development timeline moved at extraordinary wartime speed, driven by Tuve's famous management style. He posted dictates on the laboratory walls for all to see. One read, "I do not want any damn fool in this laboratory to save money. I only want him to save time." Another declared, "The best job in the world is a total failure if it is too late." A third proclaimed, "Our moral responsibility goes all the way to the final battle use of this unit." Tuve pushed his team relentlessly, accepting no excuses and tolerating no delays. Key milestones marked the accelerating progress. In December 1940, Tuve invited Harry Diamond and Wilbur Hinman Jr. from the National Bureau of Standards to join the effort. Diamond was a Russian-born immigrant who had grown up in Quincy, Massachusetts. He had earned his engineering degrees from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and Lehigh University. His prior work on radiosondes, which were high-altitude weather telemetry instruments that had to survive high accelerations, proved invaluable. Diamond designed a new fuse configuration in just 2 days after joining the team. On May 6, 1941, his group successfully tested 6 proximity fuses in bombs dropped from aircraft at the Dahlgren Proving Ground. This was the first successful American proximity fuse test. By June of that year, Section T achieved a successful test of a proximity fuse inside a 5-inch artillery shell. By September, a complete fuse had survived a full ballistic trajectory and functioned properly at the end of its flight. In January 1942, the T3 model fuse achieved a 52% success rate against water targets during testing. The Navy immediately accepted this performance level. Even with nearly half the shells failing to function properly, the proximity fuse still dramatically outperformed every conventional alternative. The mathematics were clear. A 52% functioning rate with proximity detonation was far better than a near-zero direct hit probability with conventional rounds. The contract formally establishing the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory was signed on March 10, 1942. Tuve himself conceived the laboratory's name. Operations began in a converted former used car garage at 8621 Georgia Avenue in Silver Spring, Maryland, in spring of 1942. The staff grew from approximately 100 personnel at founding to nearly 700 by 1944. The definitive proof of concept came on August 12, 1942. The light cruiser USS Cleveland conducted live fire testing against radio-controlled drone aircraft in Chesapeake Bay. The Navy had allocated 3 drone targets and scheduled 2 full days of testing. The first drone was shot down with approximately 10 rounds of proximity-fused ammunition. The second drone was also destroyed almost immediately. The third drone lasted only seconds longer before disintegrating. The Navy cancelled the remainder of the 2-day test schedule. 3 target drones had been destroyed with just 4 bursts of fire. There was nothing left to prove. Mass production commenced at 5 primary assembly companies. Crosley Corporation, RCA, Eastman Kodak, General Electric, and McQuay Norris served as the main contractors. A total of 87 firms operated 110 factories, supported by over 2,000 suppliers and subcontractors across the country. The cost per fuse dropped from $732 in early 1942 to just $18 by late 1945, a reduction of more than 97%. Production rates climbed from 500 units per day in late 1942 to 40,000 per day by late 1943 to an astonishing 70,000 per day by the end of the war. Crosley Corporation alone employed 10,000 workers operating around the clock to produce over 5 million fuses, representing nearly 1/4 of total wartime output. The program was among the first to employ mass production of printed circuits, a technology that would later transform the entire electronics industry. The VT fuse program carried a classification level second only to the Manhattan Project in secrecy. The code designation VT was officially claimed to stand for variable time, a deliberate deception suggesting nothing more sophisticated than an adjustable mechanical timer. The Army used the separate code name POZIT. Sailors who witnessed the weapon's effects in combat simply called it the funny fuse without ever learning how it actually worked. The secrecy measures were driven by a specific and well-founded fear. If the enemy recovered an unexploded fuse and successfully reverse-engineered it, the Allied advantage would be lost. Worse, the technology might be turned against Allied forces. The British had already demonstrated this vulnerability by successfully reverse-engineering a German magnetic mine that washed ashore on British beaches early in the war. With this precedent in mind, the combined chiefs of staff imposed strict restrictions on proximity fuse deployment. Until late 1944, the weapon was authorized only for naval anti-aircraft use over deep water, where any unexploded rounds would sink to the ocean floor beyond recovery. Japan was deliberately selected for the first combat deployment because, of the 3 Axis powers, Japan was judged the least capable of successfully reverse-engineering such sophisticated electronics, even if they recovered a sample. Germany, with its advanced scientific and industrial base, was considered the greatest threat. The compartmentalization of knowledge was extraordinary even by wartime standards. Component manufacturers did not know what other parts were being produced elsewhere. Assembly workers understood only their own specific tasks. Workers at Sylvania's tube manufacturing plants were searched entering and leaving the facilities and forbidden from carrying purses or bags. An estimated 3% of all physicists in the United States were working on various aspects of the proximity fuse program at the height of production. Nearly all of them knew only their small piece of the larger effort. The program was not immune to espionage. In December 1944, Julius Rosenberg, then serving as a United States Army Signal Corps Quality Assurance Inspector at the Emerson Radio Factory in New York City, stole a proximity fuse and passed it to Soviet intelligence. Rosenberg, who would later be executed for atomic espionage, assembled a duplicate fuse from discarded spare parts and smuggled it out of the facility. The Soviets thereby gained access to the technology through espionage rather than battlefield capture. This theft remained unknown to American authorities until after the war. On January 5, 1943, the proximity fuse drew first blood in combat. The light cruiser USS Helena was operating in the Solomon Islands off the south coast of Guadalcanal, returning from a bombardment mission against the Japanese airfield at Munda on New Georgia. Japanese dive bombers attacked the cruiser formation. As the enemy aircraft began their attack runs, gunners aboard Helena opened fire with 5-inch shells, some of which carried the new proximity fuses. Lieutenant Red Cochran, commanding the aft 5-inch gun battery, achieved what would become the first confirmed kill by proximity-fused ammunition in naval history. Within 2 to 3 salvos, a Japanese dive bomber disintegrated in mid-air. The shell had not scored a direct hit. It had passed close enough to the aircraft for the fuse to detect the target and trigger detonation. The resulting shower of high-velocity shrapnel tore the aircraft apart. A second plane was destroyed moments later by the same mechanism. Commander William Deck Parsons, the Navy Ordnance Officer who had personally escorted the first 5,000 proximity-fused shells from New Caledonia to the combat zone in November 1942, was aboard Helena that day. He witnessed the validation of years of development work. Parsons would later achieve even greater historical significance as the officer who armed the atomic bomb Little Boy aboard the B-29 Enola Gay during the Hiroshima mission. The statistical results of proximity fuse deployment were dramatic and immediate. During 1943, American naval guns fired over 36,000 rounds of anti-aircraft ammunition. Only approximately 25% of these rounds carried proximity fuses. But this 25% accounted for 51% of all Japanese aircraft destroyed by naval gunfire that year. The proximity-fused shells were approximately 300% more effective than conventional ammunition. Night engagement kill rates increased by 370%. Later analysis of combat data from kamikaze actions showed that 5-inch guns, equipped with proximity fuses, required approximately 200 rounds to destroy a kamikaze aircraft. The same guns using mechanical time fuses required approximately 1,000 rounds per kill. The proximity fuse provided a 5-to-1 effectiveness advantage. The weapon proved decisive in the great naval battles of the Pacific War. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, the engagement that became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, American carrier task forces deployed a layered defense combining fighter interceptors with surface ship anti-aircraft batteries, firing proximity, fused ammunition. Japanese naval aviation was effectively destroyed as a fighting force over 2 days of combat. Over 500 enemy aircraft were lost. James Van Allen himself was aboard the battleship USS Washington during this battle. He personally watched proximity-fused shells detonate a kamikaze aircraft several hundred yards short of the ship. At Okinawa, in the spring of 1945, the proximity fuse faced its ultimate test against massed kamikaze attacks. The Japanese launched 10 major coordinated kamikaze offensives against American naval forces between April and June of that year, deploying nearly 2,000 aircraft in suicide attacks. American losses were severe despite the proximity fuse advantage, with 30 ships sunk and over 300 damaged, but without the VT fuse, the carnage would have been far worse. On May 11 of that year, the destroyers USS Hadley and USS Evans were operating at Radar Picket Station 15, one of the most dangerous assignments in the naval war, when they came under attack by approximately 150 kamikaze aircraft in a concentrated assault lasting roughly 90 minutes. The gunners aboard Hadley shot down 23 attacking aircraft, establishing an all-time record for aerial kills by a single ship in a single engagement. Both destroyers were struck multiple times but remained afloat. Admiral Arleigh Burke later stated that all 5-inch ammunition aboard these ships was fitted with VT fuses, and that those fuses knocked down enemy planes by the dozens. The first authorized use of proximity fuses over land came on June 12, 1944, exactly 6 days after the D-Day landings in Normandy. The combined Chiefs of Staff approved deployment of the weapon against German V-1 flying bombs targeting London. Prime Minister Winston Churchill personally intervened to demand this authorization after the buzz bomb attacks began causing significant civilian casualties. The first V-1 had struck London on June 13, and within weeks thousands of the weapons were raining down on the city. The V-1 was a small pilotless aircraft powered by a pulse jet engine, carrying approximately 1,800 pounds of explosives at speeds around 400 miles per hour. The distinctive droning sound of its engine earned it the nickname Buzz Bomb. When the engine cut out, those below knew they had seconds before the bomb plunged earthward. Conventional anti-aircraft fire struggled to hit these fast, small targets. Section T. Engineers rapidly modified proximity fuses for compatibility with British 3.7-inch and American 90mm anti-aircraft guns. Approximately 500 guns equipped with the new ammunition were rushed to coastal battery positions along the English Channel. The transformation in defensive effectiveness was immediate and dramatic. Before the introduction of proximity fuses, the coastal gun batteries were destroying only approximately 17% of V-1 missiles passing through their engagement zones. Within 4 weeks, kill rates climbed steadily and consistently. The batteries achieved 24% effectiveness in the first week, 46% in the second week, 67% in the third week, and 79% by the fourth week. On the single best day of operations, gunners achieved an 82% destruction rate against incoming V-1s. On the last major V-1 attack day, only 4 of 104 buzz bombs launched reached London. General Frederick Pyle, commanding all British anti-aircraft defences, later wrote that it was the proximity fuse which made possible the 100% successes that anti-aircraft command was obtaining regularly by the end of the V-1 campaign. The deployment of proximity fuses against ground troops came later than naval and anti-aircraft applications due to security concerns. On October 25, 1944, the Combined Chiefs of Staff formally approved land warfare use. Substantial stockpiles of proximity-fused artillery shells in all standard calibers had already been shipped to Europe in anticipation of this authorization. The original plan called for releasing the weapon for general ground combat use on Christmas Day, 1944. The Germans themselves accelerated this timeline by launching their Ardennes offensive on December 16, 1944. Hitler had specifically chosen this date because weather forecasts predicted a week or more of low clouds, fog, and snow that would ground Allied aircraft. The Wehrmacht believed the weather would neutralize Allied air superiority and allow German armored columns to reach the Meuse River crossings before American forces could react. What the Germans did not anticipate was that the same weather conditions that grounded aircraft had no effect whatsoever on American artillery equipped with the proximity fuse. The fuse needed no observers. It did not require clear skies. It functioned perfectly in fog, snow, and darkness. Colonel George Axelson, commander of the 406th Artillery Group, made an unauthorized decision within hours of the German attack that may have altered the course of the battle. His unit had just received shipments of proximity-fused shells, but General Eisenhower had not yet granted formal permission for field artillery deployment. With the 38th Cavalry Squadron at Monschau under heavy German assault, Axelson decided that the tactical emergency overrode the security restrictions. He ordered his batteries to fire the new ammunition. The German attack at Monschau collapsed. 3 days later, on December 19, General Eisenhower formally requested clearance from the Combined Chiefs of Staff for immediate unrestricted use of proximity fuses by field artillery units. Authorization came within approximately 2 days. By December 21, all deployment restrictions had been lifted, nearly 2 weeks ahead of the original Christmas Day schedule. Over 200,000 proximity-fused artillery shells were expended during the Battle of the Bulge. The effect on German ground forces was qualitatively different from anything experienced in the history of land warfare. Against aircraft, the proximity fuse detected the metal mass of the target and detonated at the optimal distance. Against ground troops, the same mechanism detected the earth itself. Shells detonated at altitudes between 30 and 50 feet above the ground, showering lethal high-velocity shrapnel downward over wide areas. Foxholes and trenches, which had protected infantrymen from artillery since the introduction of gunpowder weapons, became death traps. Metal fragments rained from above, at angles that no earthen parapet could deflect. Communication wires were cut. Tree cover was shredded into lethal wooden splinters that caused additional casualties. Men who believed themselves safely dug in died where they crouched. The traditional doctrine that troops should take cover during artillery barrages no longer offered protection. At Malmedy on December 21, elements of SS Panzer Brigade 150 under SS Commander Otto Skorzeny launched a major assault, beginning at approximately 0300 hours. American artillery battalions supporting the 30th Infantry Division and the 291st Combat Engineer Battalion under Lieutenant Colonel David Pergrin opened fire with proximity-fused shells. The psychological effect on the attacking German troops proved as devastating as the physical casualties. Some German soldiers were observed running directly toward American positions, screaming "Kamerad," the German word for surrender. apparently preferring the risk of small arms fire to the horror of artillery that exploded overhead without warning. The American batteries fired approximately 3,000 rounds during this engagement. By mid-afternoon, Skorzeny ordered the survivors of his brigade to withdraw. The proximity fuse inflicted devastating casualties on German forces throughout the Ardennes campaign. In the 3 months from the start of the Bulge through the Rhine crossings, proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire accounted for the destruction of more than 1,000 enemy aircraft. Ground casualties from proximity-fused artillery were extensive, though precise figures remain difficult to verify. What is certain is that German commanders quickly recognized they faced a fundamentally new and terrifying weapon. One of the most remarkable aspects of the proximity fuse story is the complete failure of German intelligence and scientific establishments to understand what was happening. After the war ended, interrogations of captured German officers and scientists revealed they had no idea proximity weapons had been deployed against them. German engineers had concluded years earlier that proximity fuses for gun-launched projectiles were physically impossible. The acceleration forces were simply too severe for any electronic components to survive. This prior conviction blinded German analysts to the evidence, even when it literally fell into their hands. During the Battle of the Bulge, advancing German forces captured an American ammunition depot containing approximately 20,000 proximity fuses. This was precisely the security nightmare that had driven years of overwater-only restrictions. The American response was swift. Scientists at Harvard's Radio Research Laboratory under Winfield Salisbury had already developed radio frequency jammers capable of prematurely detonating proximity fuses at distances up to 4,000 feet. 200 of these jammers were rushed into production and installed aboard American bomber aircraft operating from England as a precautionary measure, but the precaution proved entirely unnecessary. German engineers examined the captured fuses and apparently failed to recognize their true nature. Their prior certainty that such devices were impossible prevented them from seeing what they held in their hands. The psychological impact on German combat troops was severe and well documented in American intelligence reports. German soldiers began refusing direct orders to leave their bunkers and fighting positions during artillery bombardments. Interrogators described this phenomenon as a minor mutiny spreading through forward units. Prisoners of war consistently described extreme demoralization caused by artillery that seemed to kill from impossible angles, particularly during night engagements. One captured German officer described the attacks as quick, powerful bursts, for which there was simply no defense. American intelligence officers noted that German commanders began offering substantial rewards to any soldier who could recover an intact fuse from a failed round, desperate to understand why American artillery had become so unnaturally lethal. Germany had ironically been among the first nations to research proximity fuse technology, with work beginning in the early 1930s at companies like Telefunken and Rheinmetall. But in 1940, Adolf Hitler issued a directive known as the Führerbefehl, ordering the termination of all military research and development projects that could not reach production within 6 months. This order, intended to focus resources on immediately deployable weapons, killed Germany's most promising proximity fuse programs along with advanced radar development work. German proximity fuse research was not restarted until early 1944, creating a fatal 4-year gap. By the end of the war, German industry had over 30 different proximity fuse designs under development at various companies, but the effort was hopelessly fragmented with no central coordination. Series production was finally scheduled to begin in March 1945. Allied ground forces overran the production facilities before the first fuses could be manufactured. Japan's experience paralleled German incomprehension. Japanese naval aviators and anti-aircraft gunners observed the uncanny effectiveness of American shipboard fire, shells that detonated without apparent contact and shredded aircraft with shrapnel from near misses, but Japanese technical intelligence never identified the mechanism. Late in the war, Japanese forces inadvertently discovered a partial countermeasure when they began converting wood and fabric training biplanes into kamikaze platforms. The proximity fuse relied on radio waves reflecting from metal surfaces. Wooden aircraft provided far weaker radar returns, and the fuses often failed to trigger against them. This unintentional discovery offered some protection, but came too late and was never systematically exploited. Dr. Merle Tuve remained the central figure throughout the program. He received the Medal for Merit from President Harry Truman in 1946 and was appointed Honorary Commander of the Order of the British Empire in 1948 in recognition of his contributions to Allied victory. After the war, he returned to the Carnegie Institution as Director of the Department of Terrestrial Magnetism, serving until 1966. He died on May 20, 1982 in Bethesda, Maryland, at 80 years of age. James Van Allen achieved far greater public fame for his post-war work than for his wartime contributions. The miniaturization techniques he developed for proximity fuse vacuum tubes directly enabled the instrumentation he designed for the Explorer 1 satellite in 1958, which led to his discovery of the radiation belts encircling Earth that now bear his name. He received 4 Navy battle stars for his Pacific service during the war. His wife, Abigail Fithian Halsey, had worked as a mathematician at the Applied Physics Laboratory during the war. They met through the Proximity Fuse program and married on October 13, 1945. Harry Diamond died suddenly on June 21, 1948, at only 48 years of age, before the full historical significance of his contributions could be properly recognized. He was still actively working on advanced electronics projects at the time of his death. The United States Army named an entire laboratory complex in his honor. The Harry Diamond Laboratories eventually merged into the Army Research Laboratory in 1992. The Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers established the Harry Diamond Memorial Award to honor contributions to fuse technology and miniaturized electronics. The proximity fuse was publicly revealed shortly after the Japanese surrender. On September 20, 1945, the Applied Physics Laboratory released information about the weapon for publication. Newsreel companies, including Paith, Universal, Movietone, Paramount, and News of the Day, produced documentary films revealing the secret weapon to the American public. For the first time, citizens learned about the billion-dollar program that had operated in their communities, employing tens of thousands of their neighbors who had never known what they were building. The VET fuse fundamentally transformed military technology in ways that persist to the present day. The proximity detonation principle developed at the Applied Physics Laboratory is incorporated into virtually every modern guided missile, including the Sidewinder, Sparrow, Phoenix, Standard Missile, and Patriot systems. Every time a Patriot missile intercepts an incoming threat, it uses a direct descendant of the technology developed in that converted used-car garage in Silver Spring, Maryland. The Applied Physics Laboratory itself became a permanent institution, now the largest university-affiliated research center in the United States, with a portfolio extending from guided missiles to satellite navigation to deep space exploration. The laboratory's work on the proximity fuse led directly to its post-war role developing the first satellite navigation system, the predecessor to modern GPS technology. The miniaturization techniques pioneered for the fuse fed directly into post-war electronics development. The program was among the first mass-production applications of printed circuit technology, anticipating the transformation that would reshape the entire electronics industry in subsequent decades. A cutaway proximity fuse is on permanent display at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum's Stephen F. Udvar Hazy Center in Chantilly, Virginia, donated by James Van Allen and the University of Iowa in April 1993. It measures 2 1/4 inches in diameter by 8 inches in length. Inside that small metal cylinder are 4 to 5 vacuum tubes, no larger than pencil erasers, a battery the size of a fountain pen, and 130 electronic components. Most visitors to the museum walk past it without a second glance, completely unaware that they are looking at a weapon that killed thousands of enemy soldiers and pilots. This unassuming device represents one of the most consequential engineering achievements of the 20th century. General Patton, surveying the German dead near the Sauer River that December morning, understood exactly what he was seeing. He wrote to the Chief of Army Ordnance that when all armies get this shell, we will have to devise some new method of warfare. He said he was glad that America thought of it first. The scientists at the Applied Physics Laboratory had accomplished what most experts considered impossible. They had built a radar that could survive being fired from a gun. They had created a weapon that did not need to hit its target to kill. And in doing so, they had written a chapter in military history whose influence extends to every battlefield and every missile silo in the modern world. 702 German soldiers killed in a single night near Echternach. 23 kamikaze aircraft destroyed by a single destroyer in roughly 90 minutes at Okinawa. 82% of V-1 flying bombs shot down in a single day over England. These numbers tell the story of an extraordinary engineering achievement that fundamentally rewrote the mathematics of warfare. The funny fuse did not need to score a direct hit. It only needed to get close, and close, as thousands upon thousands of enemy soldiers and pilots discovered in the final years of the war, was close enough to die.